Hi, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 28.
Chapter 28. Chad's body stiffened on the couch, eyes wide, as Mara Joy's words rang out, announcing their plan to wed as soon as possible. His palms were sweating as he tried to avoid eye contact with Alan, who had gone pale and seemed to be having trouble drawing breath. Jo Beth stared at them in shock, her mouth slightly agape, seemingly unable to process what she had just heard. The warmth of the room was replaced with heavy silence as they waited for a response. "What do you mean, as soon as possible?" Alan asked through clenched teeth. His hands clamped around the armrest. "Well, Pappy, we feel there's no reason to wait. We are in love and want to share our lives together as man and wife now," Mara Joy said, coming to kneel beside Alan's lap. "What exactly does that mean, Mara Joy? When do you plan to spend your lives together as man and wife?" Alan asked, looking into her face. His heart was breaking, and he wanted to kill the little son of a bitch sitting stunned on his couch. He wasn't a stupid man and knew what was going on, even if Jo Beth would never believe it. "It means we want to be married next week," Mara Joy beamed. "No!" Jo Beth stood up, flinging her hands into the air. "Alan!" She pleaded helplessly, unable to say anything else. "Yes, Mama," Mara Joy announced, standing up to confront her mother. "I love him, and he loves me. We need to be together." Chad sat motionless, staring at the floor as Mara Joy pleading her case, not saying a word as the scene played out before him. Alan watched the boy who had taken his daughter and shook his head in heartbreaking disbelief, his fears confirmed. His daughter would have to marry this weak, decrepit creature. She would have no choice. Her bed was made, and now she would have to lie in it with this man-child Alan could never respect. How could he respect Chad? This man— no, he was no man. This boy had robbed his daughter of her innocence. "Alan, are you going to just stand there, or are you going to talk some sense into your daughter?" Jo Beth demanded, her mind in an uproar. Everything was falling apart, and she didn't know how to stop it. As Alan gazed upon his wife of 15 years, his heart swelled with a mixture of agony and despair. His beloved was utterly oblivious to the truth, staring at her right in the face, the hidden secret behind the cries of their daughter, their precious little girl, the baby who once resembled the one she had lost long ago. He understood her fixation with Mara Joy. Even though he could see the truth of the situation as plain as day, he could not bring himself to shatter the illusions that his wife clung to so desperately. It was a portrait that she held of Mara Joy, the painting of a perfect child that simply did not exist in the world they lived in. And so, with a heavy heart full of resignation and sadness, Alan silently watched as his wife continued to turn a blind eye to the harsh reality of their situation, unable to bear the thought of shattering her fragile dreams. He couldn't. He wouldn't. He never would purposefully break her reality. "Okay, Mara Joy," Alan said, not looking at the two women gaping at him. "You will be married by the end of the week." Mara Joy squealed and ran to Alan and clasped him tightly around the neck. "Thank you, Pappy. Thank you. I love you so much for understanding," she gushed into his ear. He hugged her back with little strength. How could he tell this child of his heart that she had kicked him in the stomach with her actions? How could he tell her when she seemed so utterly happy? Jo Beth stood, fists clenched and jaw tight, her face pale and eyes wide with shock. She took a few steps away from Alan, her voice quavering as she shouted, No, you can't be serious. Every line of her body radiated disbelief as she tried to reconcile the words uttered from the man she had shared her life with for so long. You are joking! Jo Beth's hands flew to her throat. It constricted tightly, making her feel like she was choking. Her fingers wrapped forcefully around her neck in an attempt to anchor her to the scene playing out in front of her. He shook his head. Alan! Jo Beth begged, knowing his mind was set, and nothing she could say would change it. I have had enough of today, Alan declared, releasing Mara Joy's grip. I need to be alone. Jo Beth went to follow him, but Alan turned, staring her straight in the eyes, his voice abrupt. Alone. Taken aback, she watched Alan walk out of the room and wondered why on earth he would let Mara Joy get married when it was so easy to see it was the last thing in the world he wanted. When Chad and Mara Joy announced their engagement, his parents couldn't have been more thrilled. Chad was always a bit wild, and they worried his behavior would get him into trouble. But when they met Mara Joy, with her petite frame, sparkling eyes, and warm smile, the Willises knew their son had made the right choice. It was time. He would now become a responsible young man and take charge of his life, leaving the last days of childhood behind him. Mara Joy gazed at her reflection in the grand full-length mirror, her heart fluttering with excitement and nerves as she smoothed down the delicate lace and silk of her dress. The train cascaded behind her like a river of pure elegance, and she couldn't wait to make her grand entrance. Her mother and sisters had left, leaving her alone to collect herself and await her father's arrival. As she heard his approaching footsteps, her eyes brimmed with tears of joy and adoration. When she turned to face him, his eyes lit up with a fierce love that could move mountains. He cupped her chin in his hand, his voice soft with emotion as he whispered how much he cherished her. As he leaned in to tenderly kiss her flushed cheek, she felt his love wash over her entire being. At that moment, she knew she was the center of his world. With one last embrace, she linked her arm with his, ready to take on the world, knowing that her father's unwavering devotion would guide her every step of the way. He was and always would be her pappy, the first man she ever loved. Mara Joy glowed as she walked down the aisle, her gaze never leaving the figure of Chad standing tall and straight in a crisp tuxedo, his hands clasped tight in front of him. Alan's hands were clenched in fists at his sides, his face a mask of pain as he handed over the care of his daughter to the boy he was certain would break her heart. He kissed her lightly on the cheek as she ran her fingers over his sculpted jaw lovingly before taking her place next to Chad, who remained still and emotionless. "Look joyful," Mara Joy sang, her soul radiating with joy. "We don't want our guests to think we're not a happy couple." She giggled, beside herself with jubilation. She was going to be Chad's wife and the mother of his child. Her heart fluttered with happiness as she pressed her hand on her flat stomach. She couldn't yet feel the child growing inside her, but she would with time. Her life, like her belly, was expanding forward. "We are not a happy couple," Chad spit out, barely able to hold back the volume of his voice. He stood stiffly, trying not to move his mouth, unable to believe what was transpiring. He was going through with it. He was marrying Mara Joy. "Yes, we are. At least I am, and it is in your best interest to embrace and accept it." He looked away from her radiant face. How did he get from Lauren's garden bench to here? Mara Joy clutched his arm happily, excitement radiating from her every pore. Chad felt like turning and running from the church. To hell with Mara Joy. To hell with her threats. Who would believe her now? He looked at the girl by his side and thought of how many times he had held her naked in his arms. How good it felt when she touched him. He looked around the crowded church packed with his beaming parents, cheering friends and family. Everyone was happy for them, except for him. Mara Joy responded to the minister as he asked her to recite her vows, and Chad couldn't help noticing how beautiful she looked in her wedding dress. She truly was a magnificent bride. At that moment, he knew he didn't have the guts to abandon her at the altar. When it came for him to recite his vows that would seal his life forever together with Mara Joy, he did so without her pushing him. Jo Beth and Alan held a dinner and a dance after the wedding. It was a whimsical affair, filled with grandeur and delight. Mara Joy, being the enchanting entertainer she is, cherished every moment of the gala. She floated from guest to guest like a mythical creature basking in the attention of each and every one. She accepted compliments from those she knew and from those she didn't. Her cheeks flushed with delight. A tinkling laugh followed her everywhere she went. Her hands moved gracefully through the air as if conducting an unseen orchestra. In one hand, she held a crystal-encrusted glass filled to the brim with champagne and an elegantly carved ivory cigarette holder in the other. Her dazzling smile and vivacious laughter were infectious, and it wasn't long before everyone was spellbound by her presence. Chad stood off to the side, watching his wife go from person to person, laughing and chatting, the mistress of the ball. She was in her element. He felt numb, lost in an abyss. His body stuck in a vortex of dark swirling noise and laughter. The smell of smoke and booze compacted around him, crushing him down to nothing. "What on earth possessed you to marry her?" A voice interrupted his dark thoughts. He spun around, and his gaze settled on the girl. She was tall and lithe, her long light brown hair pulled up into a loose bun. She had an oval face with a delicate chin and peculiar green eyes that seemed to hold a hint of sadness. Another girl stood beside the defiant one, her features strikingly similar. They had the same slender face, but a few distinct differences separated them. The blonde's hair was a cloud of silky curls that bounced when she moved, whereas the brunette's locks were smooth and straight. Both had the same set of emerald eyes, wide and almond-shaped. Their similarities were unmistakable. They were definitely related to each other, most likely sisters. A deep blush spread across the blonde's face when the other spoke. "Are you stupid? Can't you speak? That would explain this senseless display." The girl waved her hand around the room, disgusted. No one seemed to pay any notice, except the shorter, fairer girl. "Joanna, stop it! You are making a scene." The blonde reached for the other's arm to settle her down. Joanna glared with distaste as she scrutinized Chad. She forcefully pulled her arm away from her sister and tried to compose herself. "I will never understand how no one sees through her. You all fall like stupefied animals at her feet. What makes you so mesmerized by her?" Joanna stuck out her chin defiantly. "It can't all be her looks. Is it that superficial? Can it be that pathetic?" She shook her head in repulsion, turned, and walked away. The young blonde girl was left standing, embarrassed, in front of Chad. "I am sorry. Please forgive my sister." She reached out her hand in introduction. Chad took it, amused by Joanna's outburst. It was the first entertaining thing that had happened all day. Of course, she was right. It was pathetic. Mara Joy's beauty had entranced him, just like a spooked deer in the middle of the road. And like the deer, he had been hit with a terrible blow. "My name is Constance," she said, shaking his hand. Chad leaned forward from the wall. "Who's your friend?" he asked, speaking for the first time. "That is Joanna. You must excuse her behavior. She and Mara Joy have always been at odds with one another."
"Why is that?"
He watched Joanna glare at him from across the hall. She sipped a glass of soda pop and turned away, irritated, to a small girl who also resembled her. "Chalk it up to sibling rivalry and the fact that Mara Joy has a tendency to always be the one to win." Constance shrugged her shoulders and looked to where Chad was staring. "Excuse me, I'm going to go join my sisters." She started to go, but changed her mind and turned to face him again. "By the way, welcome to the family." A crimson-red color washed over her as she averted her eyes and walked away, quickly lost in the crowd.
"Family?"
Chad said out loud. A vague recollection of Mara Joy mentioning siblings flashed briefly in his memory.
"Sisters?"
He felt confused. Joanna and Constance were the last people he would expect to be Mara Joy's sisters. Mara Joy emerged from the washroom, a smile on her face. She wore a loose white nightgown, short enough to flash the flesh of her shapely thighs as she walked. Her dark hair fell in loose coils around her shoulders. "Let the honeymoon begin!" She giggled and flopped onto the bed next to Chad.
"Go to hell,"
Chad said crossly, grabbing his pillow and heading for the couch. He kept his eyes from resting on the milky white folds of her cleavage or the way her dark curls cascaded down her back. Mara Joy bounced off the bed, pouting. "You will do as I say, Chad Willis. You won't ruin my honeymoon. Oh, no." She rolled back onto the bed and started to laugh. Chad looked at her in disbelief and headed to the couch. Mara Joy crept out of bed later that night and went to the living room. Her new husband lay fast asleep, curled up in an old quilt. She knelt down beside his sleeping form and tapped him on the shoulder. Chad, darling," she whimpered. "Please wake up, my love." He rolled over, drowsy from sleep, and looked up into her blue eyes, filling with tears. For a moment, he forgot about the wedding and the baby. His breath hitched as he looked upon Mara Joy in her white nightgown, the thin fabric clinging to her curves as it was lit from behind. The edges of her body were barely visible beneath, forming an alluring silhouette. Joanna's words echoed through his mind. Is it that superficial? Can it be that pathetic?
"What do you want, Mara Joy? I'm trying to sleep."
He turned his back to her, mad at himself for the stirrings of desire coming over him. "Oh, darling, please don't be mad at me. I love you," she whined in a little girl's voice. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She let them. She had learned a long time ago never to wipe tears away.
"Love?"
Chad sat up brutally, nearly elbowing Mara Joy, still kneeling in front of him.
"You don't know the meaning of the word love."
"But I do, because I love you." She started to cry harder, surprising even herself at how easily the tears fell. Her hand flew up to her nose to prevent it from running. He felt himself soften as he witnessed Mara Joy falling apart, but then pushed it away. She had tricked him into getting married.
"Go to bed. You got what you wanted."
He lay back down, facing the back of the couch, leaving her to stare at his back. "Don't hold this against me," she sobbed. "You can't blame me, can you?" She started to cry harder, making little heaving noises with her breath. "Hold me, Chad. Hold me like you used to."
"Blame you? Of course I blame you,"
he hollered, sitting up again. The urge to strike her possessed him. "Chad, please listen." She reached for his arm, but he pulled away, repulsed. Refusing to be put out, Mara Joy continued. "I was so scared. I couldn't go home pregnant. It would be scandalous. My poor parents would be devastated." She looked up at him, trying to place where she stood with him. His jaw was tense, but he was listening. "You don't know what it's like at home." She paused for dramatic effect. "I am the eldest of 5 children. My parents looked to me as an example to the younger ones. What would this do to them? My sister, Joanna." Chad's eyebrows shot up upon hearing Joanna's name, the spunky little kid with guts. "She is only a year younger than me. What message would I be sending her if I came home pregnant?" Tears streamed freely from Mara Joy's eyes. She took a deep breath. "My sister and I already have such a strained relationship. This would have torn us apart. How could they ever look at me with respect?" She stopped to put a hand to her quivering mouth and let out a wet sob. Chad's jaw began to slacken. He hadn't really thought about what would happen to her if they hadn't married. She would have been disgraced, ruined for life. She was telling the truth about the strained relationship with her sister. His encounter with Joanna earlier that evening was proof of that. "We could have solved the problem, Mara Joy," Chad said in a voice that was beginning to soften, although he still refused to look at her. As each word fell from her quivering lips, his wall of anger crumbled, drawing him inch by inch back to the girl he desired. "How, Chad?" Mara Joy's eyes were glazed and red-rimmed. Her face was wet from the tears she shed. "By killing it?" She shook her head, her eyes closed tight. "I couldn't kill your child. Besides, it is illegal, and many women died doing it." Her eyes bore into his, squinting ever so slightly. "Is that what you want? Do you hate me that much? You would demand me to risk death? Just so you wouldn't have to marry me?" She shook her head back and forth, a delicate hand rising to her mouth to hold back the horrific thought. "You would rather I die than to have your child?" She let out a sound, trying to hold back a sob, blinked, and shook her head again, her hand now clenched tight to her lips. He looked up into her heartbroken eyes. The light blue of her iris shone brightly against the red-rimmed lids from crying. His stomach began to churn as his heart beat quicker. God, she was beautiful. The more she spoke, the more he felt selfish. How could he have asked her to risk her life, just so he wouldn't have to marry her? Was he not just as responsible for her being pregnant? Had he not held her shuddering in his arms? "Please forgive me. I only did what I did because I was desperate and felt it was the only thing I could do. We could be happy, the 3 of us." She pressed the palms of her hands against his stomach, overcome with how much she truly wanted everything she said. She loved Chad and the child she carried. He looked at Mara Joy and yielded. They were his responsibility now, Mara Joy and the baby. The baby. It was the first time he thought of the pregnancy as that. A baby. Their baby. His. Sitting there defeated before him, she seemed more like the old Mara Joy, the one he cared for, the one he enjoyed holding. Without even thinking, he put his arms around her shaking form. "Mara Joy," he whispered, holding her quivering body tightly. She went to him willingly, hungry for his embrace. "Stop crying, babe." He cradled her head to his chest. "I've made a mess of your life. How can you ever forgive me?" She buried her face into his smooth skin and breathed in his musky scent. "I love you so much." "Shh, it'll be okay. We will work it out," he soothed, caressing her curly hair. Mara Joy lifted her head up to face him, her nightie falling open. Chad could see the swelling mounds of her breasts, and for the first time, noticed that they seemed larger than before. "You forgive me, then?"
There is nothing to forgive. We are in this together.
He smiled in spite of himself, marveling how quickly his mind had changed in just a matter of minutes. His body was heating up with desire as he held her in his arms. She bounced up happily, kissing him on the lips. "It hurt me to threaten you like I did." She pressed her full lips on his, shoving her tongue roughly inside his mouth. Chad leaned back and moaned.
Let's stop talking about it, all right?
He grasped her head in the palms of his hands, kissing her feverishly, sucking in her breath, her lips. He wanted her. He wanted her badly. She had control over him, over his body. All she had done to him was washed away with the need to have her, to consume her. "Whatever you say, darling," Mara Joy sniffed, lifting her negligee over her pointy breasts. Chad lunged for them hungrily, everything else forgotten. The next morning, Mara Joy lay awake, tangled in the sheets, naked beside her sleeping husband. She smiled contentedly to herself, her hand resting on her flat stomach. Their bodies were slick with sweat and exhaustion from the intensity of their lovemaking, reaching new heights of ecstasy together until finally succumbing to blissful exhaustion. She clung to him as he drifted into a peaceful sleep, feeling more connected than ever before, their souls entwined. Thinking about it, she felt a warm surge flow over her from the tip of her toes to her ears. She giggled, stretching out her legs lavishly. Desire built up inside her once more. "I told you, my darling, my honeymoon would not be ruined." She laughed and rolled over to kiss Chad's naked back.